For decades, the Institute and Basic Life Principles pushed one primary, terrifying message to millions of devoted followers. They preached that the secular world is a dark, depraved, and dangerous place. They taught from the pulpit and through their endless homeschooling curriculums that public schools, modern media, and secular society were essentially playgrounds for evil. According to their strict doctrine, the only way to keep your family safe, the only way to protect your children from the predators and the moral decay of the outside world, was to completely isolate them. You had to build a fortress. You had to adhere completely to the umbrella of authority. You had to follow their exhausting, hyper-vigilant rules about modesty, constant chaperoning, and total submission. They promised that if you just stayed inside their walls, if you just kept sweet and obeyed the patriarch, your family would be untouchable. But what happens when the fortress itself is actually a trap? What happens when the most terrifying danger wasn't lurking out in the secular world, but was sitting right at the dinner table, inside the most famous, supposedly perfect family the cult ever produced? Today, we are witnessing the total, catastrophic collapse of that foundational lie. The cult is scrambling, desperately trying to hide the very monsters they created, and the irony is as dark as it is devastating. Before we dive into this massive, unprecedented scandal and uncover the exclusive theories about what is really happening behind the closed doors of the IBLP right now, I need you to do something. If you want to stay ahead of the curve on this breaking fallout and support deep dive investigations like this one, take a second to impress and subscribe to this channel. Hitting subscribe and turning on notifications ensures you won't miss a single update as this case completely unfolds, because the twists in this story are happening fast, and the mainstream media is missing the deeply hidden cult connections that we are about to expose. So hit subscribe, drop a like, and let's get into the dark truth they tried to bury. To truly understand the absolute magnitude of what is happening right now, we have to go back to the golden era of the Duggar family and the Institute in Basic Life Principles. For years, Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar were not just reality television stars. They were the ultimate, most effective marketing tool the IBLP ever had. When TLC first brought their massive family to the masses, it wasn't just a quirky show about a giant household. It was a carefully orchestrated, highly sanitized infomercial for a fundamentalist Christian lifestyle. The Duggars were paraded around on national television, on morning talk shows, and in magazines as the perfect, shiny, happy people. They were the glittering prize of the IBLP, the living, breathing proof that Bill Gothard's rigid, authoritarian teachings actually worked. Jim Bob sold the cult's curriculum to millions of eager viewers, implicitly and sometimes explicitly promising that strict obedience, courtship rules, side hugs, chaperoning, and the infamous umbrella of authority would guarantee pure, successful, and morally superior children. Think about the psychology of the audience back then. Millions of parents, terrified by the changing cultural landscape, looked at the Duggars and saw a life raft. They saw children who never talked back, who dressed uniformly, who smiled constantly, and who spoke in practiced, soft voices about their love for the Lord and their parents. It was intoxicating for a specific demographic. The IBLP capitalized on this massive platform to funnel millions of dollars into their organization, selling their wisdom booklets, hosting massive seminars, and pushing their homeschooling programs. The Duggars were the poster children, the flawless ambassadors who convinced the world that hiding behind these invisible spiritual walls was the ultimate answer to life's problems. They constructed an entire empire on the premise of purity. Every single rule, no matter how oppressive, was justified by the claim that it was necessary to protect the innocent. They policed the length of skirts. They policed the media their children consumed. They monitored every single interaction between boys and girls, all under the guise of creating an impenetrable shield against sin. But it was a false image. It was a carefully constructed Hollywood set, a facade that hid a rotting foundation. The public was completely enamored, completely fooled by the denim skirts and the cheerful, wholesome family band, never suspecting that the very rules designed to keep the devil out were actually locking the victims inside with the demons. The facade didn't just crack overnight, It splintered slowly, and then all at once. For years, there were whispers, survivor testimonies, and blog posts from ex-members desperately trying to warn the world about what was really going on inside the Institute in basic life principles. But the true turning point, the moment the mainstream public finally saw the horrifying reality, was the release of the Shiny, Happy People documentary. This explosive series completely exposed the IBLP's dark underbelly, tearing down the curtain to reveal a systemic, institutionalized pattern of covering up abuse just to protect the so-called ministry. The documentary gave a voice to the survivors who had been silenced for decades by the very leaders who claimed to protect them. The public watched in horror as the truth was laid bare. The cult's exhaustive list of rules was never actually about protecting the innocent. It was fundamentally designed to protect the perpetrators. We learned about the extreme victim-blaming culture, where any horrific transgression against a child was somehow twisted to be the fault of the victim, or simply a spiritual attack to be handled internally. The church elders completely bypassed secular law enforcement, setting up their own pseudo-courts, where abusers were given a slap on the wrist, sent to a prayer camp, or simply told to repent privately, while the victims were forced to forgive and forget. The documentary showed us that the Duggar family was not an anomaly. They were the blueprint. When the first wave of scandals broke years ago regarding the eldest son, the family and the cult tried to spin it as a single, isolated incident. They played the ultimate public relations game, claiming it was a teenage mistake, a moral failing that had been dealt with through intense Christian counseling. They survived that first wave because the cult's influence was still strong enough to control the narrative. But the documentary shattered that illusion permanently. It proved that the rot wasn't just in one bad apple. The entire tree was diseased. The public realized that the teachings of the IBLP inherently fostered an environment where predators could thrive in plain sight, shielded by a culture of absolute male authority and female subjugation. But even after all of that exposure, some loyalists clung to the belief that the worst was over. They desperately wanted to believe that the system itself wasn't entirely broken, and that the remaining Duggar children were the pure, innocent victims of their older brother's darkness. And then came the absolute catalyst, the devastating action that sparked the final, irrecoverable downfall of the Duggar empire and sent the IBLP into a total tailspin. Joseph Duggar, the quiet one, the one who was supposed to be the rule-following, perfectly indoctrinated son, was arrested for a horrific 2020 felony involving a 9-year-old girl. The shockwaves from this arrest cannot be overstated. When the news broke that Joseph Duggar was taken into custody by the Tontitown Police Department and faced extradition to Bay County, Florida, the entire internet practically stopped. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't a secular media hit job. This was a massive, concrete legal action involving absolutely sickening charges of lewd and lascivious molestation. This completely and utterly shattered the illusion that the first scandal was an isolated incident. The public, and even the most hardened Duggar defenders, were suddenly forced to realize that the rot goes all the way down to the bedrock foundation of the family. Let's really look at the timeline here, because this is where the exclusive theories and the horrific reality collide. The allegations stem from a family vacation in 2020 in Panama City Beach. Think about that for a second. This wasn't a dark alleyway. This was a massive, heavily populated family trip. The very environment that the IBLP promised would be safe, surrounded by family, under the watchful eyes of chaperones, blanketed by the umbrella of authority, was exactly where the predator operated. A 9-year-old child was allegedly targeted while the rest of the shiny, happy people were blissfully unaware, or perhaps willfully blind. The victim, now 14 years old, bravely sat through a forensic interview and laid out a story so horrifying that it immediately triggered a multi-state law enforcement response. And the most chilling part of all of this is the recorded confirmation. When confronted by the victim's father, Joseph allegedly admitted to it, not just once, but twice. Once to the father directly, and a second time while a detective was secretly listening in on the line. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a recorded, documented confession of a monster operating right under the nose of the strictest moral policing system in modern America. The realization that another Duggar son, one who smiled for the cameras, who followed the courtship rules, who presented himself as a God-fearing family man, was capable of such unspeakable depravity, is the final nail in the coffin for the IBLP. It destroys any remaining argument that their way of life produces better, safer people. It proves unequivocally that their system is a breeding ground for hidden monsters. And what makes this entire situation even more enraging is the hubris of the cult leadership. The cover-up phase of this disaster is perhaps the most telling aspect of how these organizations operate behind closed doors. The exclusive theories circulating among those closest to the fallout suggest that the cult leadership assumed they could handle Joseph's transgression the exact same way they always do. They thought they could sweep it under the rug with private counseling, intense victim blaming, and forced forgiveness. They genuinely believed that their internal system of spiritual discipline was superior to the laws of the land. There is a deep, arrogant assumption within the IBLP that secular authorities have no jurisdiction over their spiritual community. They thought the Duggar name still carried enough weight, enough local power and influence, to silence the Tontitown police. They believed that by keeping everything quiet, by isolating the individuals involved and using their well-worn tactics of intimidation and spiritual manipulation, they could prevent this from ever seeing the light of day. They banked on the victims staying silent. They banked on family loyalty superseding the demand for basic human justice. They thought they had successfully contained the fallout of the past, and that this new horror could simply be absorbed into their dark, secretive history without anyone ever knowing. The hubris required to look at a recorded confession of a felony crime against a child and think, "We can handle this internally," is staggering. It perfectly encapsulates the dangerous mindset that the documentary tried to warn us about. They were so blinded by their own self-righteousness, so convinced of their divine immunity, that they completely underestimated the unstoppable force of secular justice when an actual, undeniable crime is brought to the authorities. But their arrogant assumption was completely and utterly shattered the very second the Bay County arrest affidavit dropped. This was the moment the carefully constructed dam finally broke. This wasn't a church bulletin. This wasn't a whispered rumor passed between elders after a Sunday service. And it certainly wasn't an internal disciplinary meeting that could be hushed up with a few prayers and a stern talking to. This was a massive, highly detailed, uncompromisingly public legal document. The secular justice system, the exact institution the Institute in Basic Life Principles had spent decades demonizing and teaching their devoted followers to avoid at absolutely all costs, stepped right over the heads of the church leadership. The authorities completely bypassed the so-called umbrella of authority, rendering Bob Duggar and his inner circle of protectors entirely powerless. When that warrant went live, it sent a shockwave of absolute panic through the compound. The details contained within that affidavit were so visceral, so undeniable, and so profoundly sickening that the cult's usual spin doctors were completely paralyzed. For years, they had mastered the dark art of the pivot. They knew how to take horrific abuse and water it down for their congregation, using sanitized language to describe unspeakable acts as mere moral failings, stumbling blocks, or youthful temptations that had already been forgiven by God. But they could not sanitize a sworn statement from a police detective detailing the exploitation of a 9-year-old girl. They could not spin a recorded confession, the absolute undeniable finality of a secular court document stripped away their religious camouflage. Every detail, from the timeline of the family vacation in Panama City Beach to the forensic interview of the traumatized victim, was suddenly out there on the internet. It was available for every former fan, every lifelong critic, and most dangerously, every single remaining loyal follower to read in black and white. The protective bubble had burst, and the unfiltered truth was bleeding everywhere. And when the horrific reality of this public exposure finally set in, the scramble at the highest levels of the cult was absolutely frantic. Bob Duggar, the IBLP leadership, and their entire network of fundamentalist influencers went into a total, unprecedented public relations blackout. The damage control was instantaneous and completely transparent to anyone paying attention. Overnight, social media pages that were once relentlessly flooded with daily Bible verses, modest outfit checks, and smiling, performative family photos went completely dark. Mentions of Joseph Duggar were quietly and systematically scrubbed from affiliate websites and family blogs. They flat out refused all media requests, aggressively locking the gates to their compounds and retreating behind an army of highly paid criminal defense attorneys. They closed ranks, acting as if shutting their eyes would somehow make the national news cycle disappear. But while they maintained a facade of stoic silence to the outside world, our exclusive theories and insider leaks suggest that a vastly different, highly manipulative strategy was being deployed behind closed doors. According to whispers from those desperately trying to untangle themselves from the organization, secret memos and urgent communications were allegedly being mass distributed to their most devoted, brainwashed followers. The leadership knew they could not completely ignore the headlines, so they did what cults always do when backed into a corner. They weaponized their theology. They frantically attempted to reframe this catastrophic legal and moral crisis as a literal spiritual battle. They deployed their absolute favorite defense mechanism, urgently instructing their congregations to pray against the relentless attacks of the enemy. They tried to brainwash their flock into believing that the mainstream media, the Florida Police Department, and the secular justice system were all coordinating a massive demonic attack designed specifically to destroy a godly family. They fed their followers the narrative that Joseph was being targeted simply because the Duggars stood for traditional Christian values. It is the ultimate, most insidious manipulation tactic imaginable. They are actively using the genuine faith of their followers as a human shield to protect a confessed predator from secular accountability. They are demanding that their congregations double down on their loyalty precisely when they should be running for the exits. The sheer desperation of trying to package a felony child abuse charge as religious persecution shows exactly how terrified the IBLP is of losing their grip on their remaining financial and cultural empire. They know that if the followers actually read the affidavit, if they actually digest the reality of what happened, the entire financial structure of the cult will instantly evaporate. So they lie, they obfuscate, they demand blind spiritual obedience to keep the truth from destroying them. But there is a chilling limit even to cult loyalty, and a self-serving survival instinct always trumps familial bonds when the empire is facing total annihilation. Because the charges against Joseph are so utterly heinous, so completely indefensible, and the public outrage is so deafeningly massive, the IBLP and the Duggar family machine have had to make a cold, ruthlessly calculated decision. They are quietly, but very deliberately, distancing themselves from him. Behind the scenes, the mechanics of betrayal are in full motion. The cult's continued survival, their ability to sell books, host seminars, and collect donations, depends entirely on the illusion of absolute purity. Joseph Duggar is no longer the shiny, happy, obedient son. He is a permanent radioactive stain on their multi-million-dollar brand. And so, they are isolating him to save the broader organization. The very same family and religious community that preached from the pulpit that their love and support were unconditional, bound by the sacred, unbreakable laws of their faith, is now proving to the entire world that their loyalty only lasts exactly as long as your public image remains clean. When you become a liability to the ministry's bottom line, when your actions threaten the flow of tax-free money and the unquestioned authority of the patriarchs, you are immediately cut loose and left to the wolves of the secular world they told you to fear. It is a terrifying, ice-cold betrayal that exposes the absolute emotional void at the center of their teachings. They are sacrificing him to the justice system, not out of a sudden respect for the law, and certainly not out of a genuine desire for justice for the 9-year-old victim, but out of a desperate, panicked need for institutional self-preservation. They hope that by cutting the infected branch, they can somehow save the diseased tree. This isolation tactic proves that the individual members of this cult, even the famous sons, are ultimately nothing more than disposable pawns in a much larger game of power, money, and control. They built a fortress to keep the secular world out, but the moment the secular world breaches the walls to arrest a monster, the cult locks the internal doors, turns off the lights, and pretends they never knew him at all. And this brings us to the most sickening, heartbreaking, and profound realization of this entire devastating saga. It is the ultimate tragic irony. that completely dismantles the entire existence of the Institute in Basic Life Principles. For nearly half a century, this organization built a multi-million-dollar empire on a singular, terrifying promise. If you follow our incredibly strict, hyper-vigilant rules, your family will be shielded from evil. They forced women and young girls to wear long denim skirts, policing their collarbones and their knees, claiming that modesty was a magical barrier against lust and sin. They instituted draconian courtship rules, requiring side hugs and constant chaperones, terrified that a single unsupervised moment between a boy and a girl would lead to moral ruin. They demanded absolute, unquestioning, terrifying obedience to the patriarch and the older male figures in the home, teaching toddlers through horrific practices like blanket training that their own boundaries did not matter, and that their only purpose was to submit to authority. All of this, every ounce of this suffocating control, was sold to millions as a foolproof, impenetrable shield against the predators of the secular world. But the ultimate irony is that these exact, hyper-vigilant rules did not keep the predators out. Instead, they actually provided the absolute perfect, custom-built cover for a predator to operate completely unnoticed right inside the house. When you raise a child in an environment where they are psychologically conditioned from birth to never, ever question an older male authority figure, you are not protecting them. You are weaponizing their own innocence against them. You are doing the predator's job for them. A predator inside the IBLP doesn't have to use physical force to corner a victim. The theology of the cult has already bound and gagged the victim for them. The teachings of unquestioning submission mean that when a trusted older brother, a supposedly godly, righteous man of the church, tells a child to do something, that child's brain is hardwired to obey without hesitation. And look at the specific setting of these horrific allegations. A massive, chaotic family vacation in Panama City Beach. The IBLP always championed the idea of the mega family, the giant insular pack that travels together and polices itself. They claim that being surrounded by dozens of siblings and church members provided an extra layer of absolute security. But the reality is that the sheer volume of people, the constant noise, the blurred lines of supervision in a house packed with dozens of indoctrinated followers, created a dense fog. It provided a brilliant smokescreen for a predator who knew exactly how to manipulate the system. Because everyone assumed the strict rules of the cult were acting as an invisible force field, everyone completely dropped their guard. The chaperones were likely watching out for secular strangers, completely blind to the fact that the monster was wearing a polo shirt, smiling for the vacation photos, and using the cult's own umbrella of authority to isolate a 9-year-old girl in plain sight. The rules didn't stop the evil. The rules were the camouflage the evil wore to blend in. The very system designed to protect the sheep was actually written by the wolves. And this brings us to a massive, breaking recent update that is sending absolute shockwaves through whatever is left of the fundamentalist community. While the Duggar family and the IBLP leadership are desperately trying to maintain their blackout, hoping the news cycle will just move on, the secular justice system is only just getting started. Based on our exclusive theories and whispers coming from deeply embedded sources who are watching this legal battle unfold, the scope of this investigation might be expanding far beyond a local Florida police department. There is intense speculation, fueled by the multi-state nature of the crime and the recorded confessions, that federal authorities have started quietly requesting documents. When you have a massive, highly funded organization that has a documented, systemic history of handling felony child abuse internally, crossing state lines for massive family retreats, and potentially using church funds to cover up or legally defend admitted predators, you cross a very dangerous line. The exclusive theory circulating right now suggests that the feds are looking very closely at the institutional cover-ups. They are allegedly asking questions about who knew what, when they knew it, and whether the IBLP's internal pseudo-courts actively conspired to obstruct justice by hiding these crimes from state authorities for years. If these exclusive theories prove true, and federal investigators are preparing to rip the roof off the IBLP's headquarters, it means we are looking at the potential criminal indictment of an entire religious institution. The paper trail of internal memos, the forced counseling sessions instead of police reports, the financial records of how they silence victims, all of it could be subject to federal subpoena. The cult leadership is reportedly terrified because they know their usual tactics of spiritual intimidation do absolutely nothing to stop a federal agent with a search warrant. The fortress they built to keep the secular world out is being systematically dismantled, brick by the very laws they thought they were above. The panic inside the compound is palpable because they know the Duggar name can no longer save them. The shiny, happy facade has entirely rotted away, leaving only the horrifying truth of what happens when absolute power is given to men who believe they answer to no earthly authority. We are witnessing the end of an era, the complete and total destruction of the most famous fundamentalist family in modern history, brought down not by the secular world they feared, but by the darkness they nurtured in their own living room. The fallout is massive, the legal battles are only just beginning, and the true extent of the cult's cover-up is finally being dragged into the unforgiving light of day. Is the IBLP officially finished after this second Duggar scandal? Do you think the feds are looking into the cult next? Drop your thoughts in the comments and hit subscribe for more deep dives.